Thank you. I know.
Or the rest of you joining us.
Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are learning Maseches Chullin, Daf Nun Beis, and we're starting on the bottom of Nun Aleph Amud Beis, 2/3 of the way down, right after the parentheses. We know, of course, from the open of the Mishnah on Daf Mem Beis that there is a treifa called nefula, that if an animal falls, that it becomes treif and you can no longer consume that food. So says the Gemara again at the open of the parenthesis, right after the parenthesis. Amar Ameimar Mishmei Deravdimi Min Arda Nefula Sha'amru Tzricha Badika Keneged Bnei Me'ayim. If an animal does fall, and it's the kind of fall that doesn't inherently make it a treifa, like we saw. Let's say it jumps through the roof, whatever the case may be, like we saw yesterday. But when you are able to eat it, and there is a din bedika, if you would like a sheet, you're welcome to that. So then the halacha is it's bedika keneged b'nei me'ayim. You really just have to test and check the gastric area. Amar le mar zutra hachi amrina mishmei de Papa. That's not true. Tzricha bedika keneged beis hachalal kulo, the whole bottom side of the animal, the whole torso of the animal. You have to check everything. Amar lehuna mar berei de Rav Nechemya le Rav Ashi Simon and Mai. What about the kana and the veshet? How come you're not checking those? Aren't those the most fundamental aspects of kashrus when it comes to a shechita? We've spent so much time talking about the veshet. The kuva beveshet is going to be a treifa by the kana. We know that there are different rules. We're more lenient by the kana. What about that? If an animal falls, shouldn't we also have to check the simanim? The Gemara says no. Amar lay 2 lines into the wide line. Simanim kashin hein eitzel nefila. The simanim, the kana, the veshet, the esophagus, and the trachea, they're in good shape. The animal falls, they're not going to dislodge. Your body hits. Innards of your neck don't hit. So the Gemara is less concerned. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. What about an oaf? Shenechvat al pnei hamayim. Yeah, they nosedives. The bird just goes full speed into the water. The fastest animal on the planet is the peregrine falcon, 200 miles an hour. Could you imagine hitting the water at 200 miles an hour? When you jump off a diving board, it can hurt. And that's just gravity. So obviously it could be quite bad. So the Gemara over the next many, many lines is going to be dealing with different issues and versions of whether or not we consider a bird flying into something problematic. Says the Gemara, if it lands, then once it swims the length of its own body, now I know the bird is okay. It has to swim, not float. It has to swim, whatever birds do when they swim. Look, let's say a duck will move its feet. Once it moves the length of its body, dio, to say that it's not a treifa. If it can't move the length of its body, then it is a treifa. That's a concern of risu kevarim. When do we say that if you swim the length of your body, you're good to go? That's only if you're swimming mimata lamala, from downstream to upstream, because you're showing that you have the muscular ability to fight the stream. Aval milamala lamata, that's easy. You're just going with the current. Mayahu di ishbalu. The imaya kaime. What if the water was sitting still? Less lanba, then your movement counts and you would not be considered a treifa. No concern of risu kevar. The point is that we need to see some active movement of this bird after it hits the water. No distinctions at all. Any bird, as long as it's able to swim of its own accord, if you're swimming downstream, you have to swim faster than the downstream. If you're swimming upstream, any upstream, and if the waters are static, then any movement at all is going to be, it'll remove you from the category of treifa. Let's say there's pieces of wood floating. So let's say the wood is floating downstream at 2 miles per hour. And you are vikadme, you go faster, the bird goes faster than 2 miles an hour. Now we see that it has its own activity, it has its own mobility, and therefore says the Gemara, Hakadme givaldik, you're going faster. That means that there's no concern of risu kevarim, and you are not a treifa. Let's say the bird flies into the top of a canopy, glima matiach. Let's say it flies into a canopy where the fabric is stretched over numerous poles, let's say 4 poles. I've seen this in Eretz Yisrael. They have these parks, and in these parks, they have these canopies on them. If a bird flies into one of those, and it's glima matiach chayshina, that's a very tight piece of fabric. The animal goes into that, he's going to get really hurt. What if it's the lo matiach? What if the fabric wasn't so tight? No problem, lo chayshina. What if it was of umeufaf? What if, this is an interesting phraseology, I would not have thought that this is what it meant, but the Meforshim explained, this is talking about the fabric being doubled. What if that was a flying terminology? No? It's not how the Meforshim explain it. Let's see, where's the Rashi on this one? Of me'ofev v'im kful hatalis ve'ena metucha. If it's something that's folded and kind of draped over, seemingly, or some version of the fabric that it's not so tight, then lo chayshina. What about isla, a net? If you have netting, now obviously the way nets are made is that there's knots everywhere. So if umakarve kitre, if all the knots are tight together, then chayshinan, we're afraid that because of the thickness and density of the knots, when the bird flies into it, it's going to be a problem. Lo makarve kitre, if the knots are not tightly together in the netting, then you're good to go lo chayshinan. Kitna, what about flax? The avid betuni. What if it's made into a bundle? Well, if it's made into a bundle, flax in a bundle is very tight, therefore chayshinan. What if the bird fell off to the side? So the bird didn't land direct. It wasn't a direct hit. It just kind of rolled off the side. Lo chashina, not a problem. Asuraisa. What if we had reeds in a bundle? Chashina. Let's go back to kitna, to the flax. So if the daik v'nofitz, if it was hammered, because when you hammer flax, then it separates into strands. On its own, it looks like a stalk. You hammer it, it will separate into strands. If it was daik and v'nofitz, and you combed it to make it out very, very thin, every strand on its own, lo chayshinan, a bird went into that kind of material, no problem. However, if it was daik, you hit it down with a hammer, but below nafitz, but it wasn't combed yet, then we are concerned chayshinan. De ovid bizri. What if what if you made it into bundles? These types of materials made into bundles. Because we're concerned if it's below nafitz. If you made it into bundles, there's kind of these bumps in it. There's kitri, literally translates as knots from the word tough and shin. Test and shin in Aramaic are interchangeable. So maybe some kind of knots. A kesher chayshinan. Daksa chayshinan. The Gemara translates this as if there's broken parts of the stalk, then we're concerned. To karkasa, the soft parts of the stalk, lo chayshinan. What if it is navra, the fibers that grow around the palm tree, chayshinan? Timchasa, the softer parts of the fibers, lo chayshinan. We're not familiar with any. It's just so it's so hard to relate to because we don't utilize most of these things. The only thing I understood here was the netting, because nets, if it's very loose, then the knots are fewer and far between. But our materials are so much softer. We have silk, we have stretchy. They didn't have stretchy materials the way we do. We could create a trampoline landing that a bird would be totally fine hitting potentially. Again, I don't know how tense does it have to be. We don't have any of those answers.
Might even just creating if it's hard, it's a problem. If it's soft, it's not a problem. You're giving 75
I do think that's what's happening. I just think it's so hard to define what hard and soft is. So when you give 10 examples, by the time you're done, if you give a whole bunch of culturally normal examples, you'll be able to figure out on your own the other cases. From here, I can't figure out anything. I have no idea lemaisa what that means. Water, you gave me a good answer there. Can it swim afterwards? I hear you. That's a very functional terminology, but there's a billion materials out there. Nobody's talking about concrete, right? Because that I think we all know. Yeah, pshita, right? All of these commercials of birds flying straight into the sliding door about how wonderful the Windex is. They did such a good job. The birds didn't even know it was there. Give out, like now they're dead. And we've seen birds like this in front of our very shul, where birds have died flying into the window. So obviously those aren't discussed. They're middle of the road cases. If we were to apply this to our modern culture, we'd pick 10 examples, and then we'd kind of be like, well, the Gemara says this. What's this new case most similar to? Kitma, what if there's ash? So nihila, if it's filtered ash, then chayshina. Lo nihila, if it's not filtered ash, lo chayshina, because it's much softer. Turn to the top of Nun Beis Medalef. Chol hadak, if we have very, very fine sand, seemingly a softer version. Rashi says at the top of the page, lo chayshina, why? The mishtarik, the eno nichbash leolam, it's very slippery almost, which is a bit of a strange terminology to use for sand, because it's not slippery like you're going to slip. What if you go head first in it? So seemingly it means it's just going to move around a little bit. Chol hagas, but if it's thicker sand, I guess something more coarse, that would be chayshinan. Avak drachim, if you go into the dirt that's on the regular ground as you're walking, chayshinan. What about tivna? What about hay or straw? So if it's va'avid bizga, if you make it into a bale of hay, chayshinan. Lo avid bizga, if it's just laying loosely, then lo chayshinan. Chite, what about wheat? V'chol diminayu, anything that's like wheat. What do we know that's like wheat? Nothing, because we're not an agricultural culture, but there are things that are like wheat. However, and this is a quick deviation, what about sari? What about barley, which I would have thought was similar to wheat, but I don't know anything about agriculture. And we're missing a word in our Gemara, lo chayshinan. A very important amendment by the Maram Shif, as you can see on this side. Kol mine kitnias, any legumes, peanuts, whatever the case may be, beans, basically beans and peanuts. Ein bahem mishum risuke evarim. If they go head first into a whole thing of edamame, you're good to go. Labar min rubia, except for fenugreek. Chimti, what about peas? Ein ba mishum risuke evarim. Nobody likes peas, but if a bird flies into them, you're good to go. Chifti, which is chickpeas, then yesh ba mishum risuke evarim, that we are concerned about. Klala de milsa. Let's broaden this to get to 30,000 feet so we have a little bit of a better feel. Ari, this really does go to your question. Kol midi de mishrik, anything that has more of a slippery consistency, or we should add in that's a little bit softer. Ein bo mishum risukei varim, lo mishrik, yesh bo mishum risukei varim. Very good. So far, so good. So far, so good. All of these cases talking about birds kind of doing a nosedive into some material. And the klala de milsa is that if it's smooth or soft, you're good to go. If it's hard and not so soft, then you are not good to go. Davuk. What if a bird flies into a trap and it's sticky? We actually have these for mice. They're glue traps. If a bird were to fly on into one of these traps and get stuck, that would be very problematic. We do this for mice all the time. Shilas of tsar b'alei, if you're allowed to do that, actually. Is it better that they should be killed or that they should be suffering? Which one is better? They don't belong in your house. There's no way sort of trapping mice, but what is the most humane, halachically humane way to do that? Good. So if it's davuk, now we're going to have a double layered machlokes. Rav Ashi Amar Shari. This is not going to be problematic. If it lands in a trap, it still can be kosher. But a meimar is asar. Let's get into the details. Bechad gapa, if only one of its wings gets stuck in the glue, to kule amalo pligi d'shari, everyone agrees that that's good to go, no problem at all. Ki pligi, when is there a machlokes between Rav Ashi and a meimar? That's only betray gape when both wings get stuck. Man de asar, according to a meimar who says that it's asar when it's both wings. How in the world is this thing supposed to travel? Its mode of transportation is stuck. The wings are glued down. Uman Shari, according to Rav Ashi, why would he be matir if both wings are stuck? Amarlach, efshar denekum ikve degape. On the edges of the wings, you're able to kind of move around a little bit. You're right. You're still kind of sort of stuck. You can't really fly, but you can hobble. Just
the trap is that it's going to break a bone or something. It's going to get out.
No, it's not concerned
It's
that.
immobilized.
What were we going to say?
I think it says here that it falls with him, like the glue trap falls to the ground with him or something. So
Yeah.
like the flapping wings soften
Yeah.
the blow,
Causes
where the
it to-
two wings.
I
just
think
don't
it
soften the
seems
blow.
like it's a concern of Risuke Varim. That's always been our concern, no? Let's see if Rashi talks about this. Davuk. Rashi says, gluda belaz v'tachin asobedaf katan. You put glued, it's the same exact word. Ve'of shochen alav midbak ba'uporech im hadaf v'nofel la'aretz. It flies while it still has this thing attached to it. And obviously when it falls, it hits the ground harder than it normally would because it can't land in a normal way. Yeah. Some say no, the machlokes is not when it's tre gape, but really that's the pashut case. Kule amalo pligi de aser. I'm sorry, I skipped some words. But tre gape, when it comes to two wings, kule amalo pligi de aser. How is the bird going to fly with two? In that case, is easier to understand for us. But really, the machlokes is ki pligi bechad gapa, when only one wing is stuck to the glue pad. Man de shari amar lach efshar de parach bechad gapa. You can kind of sort of fly with one wing. I've never seen a bird fly with one wing, but I don't know anything about birds. Man de asar, according to a meimar who says that no, it's asar even if it's going to be within one wing. Kevin de bahai lo mati parach. Since you can't fly with the wing that's stuck in the glue, guess what? Bahai nami lo mati parach. How do we paskin? Betray gape aser bechad gapa shari. So we hold that with one wing it's mutter, which means we hold like the ikad amre in regards to the machlokes being only bechad gapa, and we hold like the lenient opinion of Rav Ashi that if one wing is stuck, you're still allowed to say that animal could land safely, and we do not have a concern of risuk e varim. That was the easy part for today. Let's get to the difficult part for today. Almost halfway down, 3 lines before the wide lines, on Beis Medaf says the Gemara, Nishtabri rov tzal oseha. If most of the ribs break, Tan Rabbanan. Elohein rov tzal os. What does it mean, rov tzalos, the majority? Bit interesting. Can't you just count? Why can't you just count? So we're going to see in a minute that it's actually not so pashut to just count. Sheish mikan v'sheish mikan. It's either 6 from each side. Achas esrei mikan ve'achas mikan. So look at it's either 6 and 6 or 11 and 1, or any iteration there of the totals, the number of 12. Now here is the hard part. If you look inside a cow, you'll see that there are 13 pairs of ribs. So the problem is that it doesn't work, right? Because 13, is there 13 pairs?
Yeah.
13, yeah, 13 pairs is 26. And 12 is not rove. So what does that mean, rove? So the answer is we're going to see in a couple lines, but I have to foreshadow to understand even this. The din is that we exclude 2 of the rows of the ribs because they're so thin, those ribs, they have no marrow in them. And when we talk about bones that break, that are shaykh to becoming a treifa, it's only bones that have marrow. So therefore, we have a lower number of bones to look at, and therefore 12 is the majority. Amar Zeiri, Umechzion Klape Shidra, when we talk about these breaks, it has to be on the upper half of the body. So let's say we see an animal standing in front of us. Here's the top of the animal, spine right here, ribs wrapping around. They wrap around all the way, have to be the upper half of the body where the body tapers to the top. That's what Zeiri is adding over here. And Amar Rabba, Bar Barchana, first of the long lines, Amar Rav Yochanan, Uvitzalos Gedola Sheish Ben Moach. We're only talking about bones that have marrow. That's why the 12 is a rove. Otherwise, the 12 wouldn't be a rove because 13 times 2 is 26, and 12 is less than half of that. So the only way we get to the psulim of our Mishnah of broken ribs is if we have 12, but excluding the bones that don't have marrow in them. Amar Ula, what does Ula say? Ben Zakai Omar ne'ekru, if there was some type of bone that got disconnected, I guess some type of separation, that's berov tzad echad. That's the majority of even one side. So let's say 6 even on one side, that would be considered a treifa. We're not talking about broken bones. Our Mishnah was talking about broken bones. Nishtabru. Here we're talking about dislocation. By a dislocation, that's rove even on one side. So only 6, not 12. Dislocation is 6. Broken is double 6. Good. Nishtabru berov shnei tzadin. This tracks. And when it comes to broken, it has to be most on both sides. It's actually more machmir to have a dislocation. Your treifa level is at a lower threshold when you have a dislocation than when you have broken bones, which is honestly fascinating. Yeah. That's an interesting thing, but that's what Rav Yochanan ben Zakkai held. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, not Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but Rabbi Yochanan the Amora, arguing on Ula. Ula quoted ben Zakkai to say that Nekru and Nishtabru were different. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, no. Ben Nekru, ben Nishtabru, berov shnei tzadin. Where did you come up with this? He got it from ben Zakkai, obviously. But Rabbi Yochanan disagrees that we compare and equate the Nekru and the Nishtabru. Really, both of them should have the same din. We're not makbid to say that dislocations could be even 6 and not 12, but broken is 12. No. They're both 12. They're both 6 and 6 or 11 and 1, whatever the iterations are that we saw earlier. Okay. This next sugya is quite complicated. We really need a couple hours to unpack this. We don't have a couple hours. Actually, we probably do, but we're not going to do that. 4 lines down into the wide lines. Let's put on our thinking caps. Amar Rav. Let's talk about this. Ne'ekra tzela v'chulia. Let's say there was a dislocation of a rib and the vertebrae to which it is connected to. Now, we are built differently. Our rib cage is front to back, but the rib cage doesn't connect to the spine. They're built the other opposite way. Spine on the top, ribs connecting, wrapping around much of the way. Totally different structure than us. So it's a little confusing, and we just have to remember that that is what we're talking about over here. So it says Rav. If we don't understand Rav here, it's only 10 words, 5 words. But if we don't understand Rav, we will not understand the rest of the Gemara. Might not understand the rest of the Gemara even with Rav. Let's try and figure it out though. Nekra tzela b'chulia. If we have a dislocation of a rib, along with its corresponding vertebrae, ima, then it's a treifa. Totally breaking all the rules. What did we say earlier? Even according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he said that if there's ne'ekar by the ribs, it's rove, it's 6 of one side. What do we see over here? That adding in the factor of the chulia, when 2 of them are dislocated, then we only need a singular rib and its vertebra in order to be treifa. Amre le Rav Kahana v'Ravasi, I don't understand. Le Rav, according to Rav, nekra tzelamikan v'tzelamikan v'chulya kayemes. Let's say vertebra number 6, whatever it is, the one that's a center line vertebrae, and then the ribs disconnect from each side. Mahu, what would the halacha be? So Amar le gistra ka'amrisu. We learned about the din of gistra. Gistra is an animal that you slice in half, and in this case, what we're talking about is an animal that's sliced according to the length of the animal. Just imagine a saw cutting through the animal from tail to neck, but under the rib cage. Through the rib cage, under the spine. So Rav says your case is a ridiculous case, because if you have 2 ribs that fell off of a vertebra, for sure that's going to be a treifa. In fact, it would even be worse than that. It potentially might even be a nevela, but we're not going to talk about that now. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Rav, your case is exactly the same. Why isn't your case a gistra too? The Rav nami gistra ka'amar, because you said that it was nekra from the vertebra. It was nekra from the spine. Why wouldn't you say the same thing? No. Kika amar Rav, and now we're going to change what Rav said, so we have to remember what he said and contrast it. Kika amar Rav, that was talking about sel below chulia. Rav was only talking about, really, we have to change what he said. It was only talking about a rib, but without the vertebrae. How can you say that? That's not what the word said. It's not what Rav said. Says the Gemara, yeah, but we're actually dancing in the middle here. How so? Tzela v'chatzi chulia. What we're talking about is a rib that dislocates and a vertebra that partially dislocates. That's Rav's case. If we look back up at Rav, so what is Rav saying? Rav says that if we have a dislocation of a rib and a partial dislocation of that rib's vertebra, then it's going to be a treifa. Michlal, what does that imply? To Rav Kahana v'Ravasi, we're not talking about that case where it was partially connected, but rather tzela below chulia amrei. And to that, what did Rav say to them? V'amar lahu, that when we have a rib that's dislocated, but the vertebra is in place, v'amar lahu gisra ka'amrisu. There, Rav says, how could you say that, Ravasi? How could you say that, Rav Kahana? That's a case of gisra, for sure it's a treifa. V'amar ula, that can't be, because what did Ben Zakkai say? Amar, nekru berov tzad echad nishtabru berov shnei tzadin. So what we have over here is a problem that Rav doesn't really have a shita in the Tanoim that fits with him. Because according to Rav, he holds that a tzela and a chatzi chulia is a treifa. And then he also holds that a tzela without a chulia is a gistra. But nobody else seems to hold that way. What does Ben Zakkai hold? That if you have a tzela that's removed, it's rov tzad echad, it's 6 ribs that passel you. And therefore, how can Rav hold that only one passels you? The math doesn't work. So Amar Lach, how would Rav answer you? 2/3 of the way down, 8 lines, 9 lines into the white lines. Hasam zeh shelo keneged zeh, hacha zeh keneged zeh. When we say that it's a rove, that's when that the rib is not corresponding. You have 2 ribs that dislocate, but it's not on the same vertebra. They're off a little bit. Then we need 6. That's fine. But hacha zeh keneged zeh, then even 1, Rav would say is problematic. That's when you have them rib 6 on the right, rib 6 on the left, and it's going to be problematic. That's how he would answer. Says the Gemara, no. If you have a rove, if you have 6 on each side, there are only 10, 11 options of ribs. There's no way that there isn't an overlap where 2 ribs are in fact opposite one another and dislocated. It's impossible. Says the Gemara, Hasam buchna below asisa. This is a mortar and a pestle. It's a reference to a mortar and a pestle, which is a reference to a mortar and a pestle, which is really just a mashal for, the rib and its connection to the spine. Hasam buchna below asisa. One is talking about the rib without the chulia, and hacha buchna v'asisa. So we have different types of connections. Sometimes it's connected to the spine, sometimes it's not connected to the spine, so it's not exactly the same case. So it says the Gemara, that's the answer. No. Ihachi, hainu de Rav. That was exactly Rav's case, where sometimes it's connected and sometimes it's not. So it says the Gemara, it must be that Rav Kahana and Ravasi, who were Talmidim of Rav, lo shmiya lahu de Rav. They must not have heard this din, because their question, they wouldn't have asked this question if they had sat in front in Rav's shiur that day. They ditched. I don't know, whatever. They missed shiur that day. So obviously they didn't hear the din of Rav, because if they would have heard it, they never would have asked their question of, oh, what about? No, you would have heard shot in shiur. There's no way you would have asked. Why didn't they just ask the question the way Rav did, which is talking about only one rib? What was the question that Rav Asi and Rav Kahana asked? If you look back up, the way that they asked their question, 6 lines, was Tzelamikan v'Tzelamikan. Why did you ask that way? If you didn't even know the din of Rav, why would you skip to 2 ribs? Ask about 1. It's a lower level case. You're asking a weird question. So it says Gemara, Savre, what was their thinking? The Gemara says as follows. Savre, they hold as follows. They were concerned as follows. If we would have said to Rav, I only want to know about 1 rib, and then to parish lantarte, I'll be able to be mendaik about 2 ribs. How so? If we would have asked Rav about the dislocation of 1 rib, if Rav would have said that 1 rib is a treifa, then kol shekain tarte, for sure 2 ribs is going to be a treifa. Fine. But if Rav would have said that 1 dislocated rib is kosher, akati tarte kami bailan, we would have been left with a question. We didn't want to ask the question that way. And therefore, we asked 2 instead of 1. Says the Gemara, that's a ridiculous svara, because the opposite could leave you with a question too. Ihachi, says the Gemara, 10 lines from the bottom. Even if you start with 2, you're going to be left with a problem either way. Let's draw our question again. Rav, they didn't hear Rav's question. They weren't in shiur that day. So why did you ask about 2 ribs? Ask about 1. They said we didn't want to. We were afraid if we asked about 1, we wouldn't have known all of our answers. Says the Gemara, no. If you ask about 2 ribs and he says 2 ribs are kosher, then kol shekain chada, 100% I could make my diuk. But if you are trying to chap a Ryan and asking 1 question and getting 2 answers, here you don't get that. The Amarlu treifa. If he would have said that 2 ribs is treif, what question do we have left? Okay, but Rebbe, what about 1? Akati chadami boilahu. So we don't understand Rav Kahana and Ravasi because their question, they started in the wrong place. They started at level 2. They should have started at level 1. Why are you asking about 2 dislocated ribs? Ask about 1. So it says the Gemara, Savre, that im came that there was only 1 rib, and they asked about 1 rib, mirtach karotach. They thought that Rebbe would have gotten angry. Chada, treifa, tarte mibaya. They wanted to ask like a more complex. They were like nervous to ask about the simple case of 1. Like, I guess they were supposed to know. I don't know. It's a little odd, but they were afraid to ask that. Says the Gemara. But in the second case, what did they do? They asked in the second case, they asked about 2. Still didn't know the answer after they asked the question. And there he wasn't upset. They asked a question about 2. The lo ratach, he didn't get upset. Says the Gemara. Yes, he did. What was Rav's getting upset at them? Kevan de ka'amar luhu gisra ka'amrisu. He asked a rhetorical question. Guys, you're going to dissect the animal and have pashut that it's a treif. You guys are a bunch of amaratzu. So it says the Gemara, Hainu ritche. That was Rav getting upset. So that's the end of this little sugya. This is a complex piece of Gemara, and there's a lot missing from the words in the Gemara. But in short, we have a lot of confusion around this memra of Rav. And one of the reasons it was confusing is simply because Rav Asi and Rav Kahana weren't in shiur that day. So they were kind of guessing and trying to figure things out. Toward the bottom of the page, 3 lines. Where are we? Yeah, 3 lines from the bottom of the page on Nun Beis Amud Aleph. We're going to stop about halfway down on Nun Beis Amud Beis. Let's go. Amar Rabbi Bar Rav Shila, Amar Rav Masna, Amar Shmuel, Nekra Tzela Me'ikara. One type of psul is where a bone gets fully dislocated. The Gulgela if there's a skull that's completely crushed, or that's 51% crushed, ubasar hachofe es rov hakeres berubo, or the flesh that covers most of the innards of the body. In all of these cases, if it's a majority, treifa. Let's pick them apart one at a time. Says the Gemara, nekrat selamei kara treifa. We said about the case that if there's a bone that's dislocated, it's a treifa reminu. Hold on 1 second. How can you say that? Top of Nun Beis Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, that's not true. It's not true. Just read the language of the Gemara again. It's not true that Nakra Tzeleme Ikara is a treifa. How do we know? Because let's go back to a case that we saw a while ago. This was a case about finding a human skeleton and whether or not it's tameh. Kama chesron bishedra. What type of deficiency do we need to have in the spine so that there will be no tumas ohel? That was the case that was being dealt with over there. If we're missing 2 of the vertebra, so then there will be no tumas ohel. If you're a Kohen, this is a big deal. Even if you're missing only 1. Shmuel says the same exact halacha applies to a treifa. It's only one problem. What's a chulia? Vertebra. What was the case we were talking about? A rib. Nakratzela me'ikara. You wanted to say that it's a rib. It's not a rib. It's a vertebra, and they're not the same thing. So the line on the bottom of the page from that statement of Rabbi Bar Shila is conflicted by the Gemara that says that treifa happens with the vertebra level, not with the rib level. It's a good question. So it says the Gemara, Hacha tzela below chulia, hasam chulia below tzela. The case that we learned on the bottom of the page was a rib without the vertebra. There we can potentially have a psul. But in our case, it's a chulia below tzela. That's the case of Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Says the Gemara, that's great, but we have a biological problem. I could understand the ribs getting dislocated without the vertebra getting dislocated, but how do you lose a vertebra without losing the ribs if they're connected to one another? Ella, if the rib is centered and connected on the right to one rib and on the other side to another rib, and it dislocates, then it's not located to then it's not connected to either rib. So what is your case scenario where you have chulia below tzela? Says the Gemara, we do have this. Nishhali bishilhi kafli, lower down on the spine. We have this also. Where do we have ribs? In the thoracic area, covers our chest. Lumbar, sacral area, no ribs. Our ribs are mid-chest and up. Put your hands over your stomach. There's no ribs there, but there's still spine, thank God, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to walk, right? So what the Gemara says is the case of chulya belotzela, that is a case that's not dealing with the rib cage. So you can't bring a raya from the case of a Beis Shammai Beis Hillel as to when a skeleton does not cause tumas ohel. Perhaps we're talking about ribs that are lower down on the body. Maskef la Rav Oshaya, belisnei gabe kule Beis Shammai v'chorme Beis Hillel. If Shmuel is right of v'chein l'treifa, that the halacha is not only by a chulia is it true, by tumas meis, by tumas ohel, but it's also true by a treifa. Why wasn't it listed in the list of things where we had a kula for Beis Shammai and a chumrah from Beis Hillel, which is rare, says the Gemara, because it wasn't the right topic. Not that it isn't true. It is a kula of Beis Shammai and a chumrah Beis Hillel, but it doesn't apply here. It shouldn't be in the list because Amar le Rav ki ischil le'inyan tuma ischil. That conversation by Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, whenever we talked about the Kula Beis Shammai, Kula Beis Hillel, it was talking about Tuma. But that's not our case. Tahavalu Beis Shammai l'chumra. But our case is talking about Treifa, not about Tuma. Different halachos. At the 2 dots, 10 lines down on Nun Beis and Beis, v'golgela shenechbas abaruba. What case are we talking about that the skull was greatly crushed? By Rav Yirmiyah, Rov Gova or Rov Hakefa? Are we talking about the majority of the height of the skull? Where do we start from? Don't know. I assume from the base of the neck, but I'm only saying that from biology class. I don't know where halacha would start that. Maybe I do actually. We said in the neck of the animal that there were these 2 things at the base of the spine, below which was chut hashedra. So let's just call it the nape of the neck, whatever the case may be. So if we see that there's a rove of an ant, we're talking about animal now, not people. If we see that it's rov gova, either the majority of the height was crushed, or rov hekefa, which is the circumference. Maybe the height is not the majority. Maybe that's only 10%, but it's crushed around the rove. Then what would the halacha be? The answer is teku. By the way, this exact phraseology comes up in the halachos of bris milah. Is there enough skin left over berov hekefo or berov gofo, in which case the bris won't be kosher? If there's skin left over at any one point that's 51%, you have to do another bris with a bracha. The bris wasn't kosher. This doesn't happen very often. You have to either have a very complex anatomy or not be good at your job, but one of the two, but it's not very common. But I had this shaila in the OR 2 weeks ago. I was standing there not knowing what in the world was going on. These surgeons are doing a whole complex thing. I'm watching the procedure, and as they're doing the procedure, I see the skin that's going to be left over is not very tall. I called Rabbi Reese from the OR. What should I do? The skin's not rov gova, and it's not rov hekefo. He said, you're not allowed to make a bracha because the baby's effectively gemalt. We have to do a tafas tambris, do the cut. That's fine, but you're not allowed to make a bracha. Same exact terminology, but over here by different context. Next, another 10 lines. Ubasar achof rov hakeres berubo. We said, what about the flesh that covers the innards? Boy Ravashi, berov karua. When we say berov, is the treifa status only when the majority of it is torn, or berov natul, or where most of it is removed? Very big difference, but we don't know. Says the Gemara, Tiv Shalemi Ditnan. We have a Mishnah. Let's see what the Mishnah says. Keres hapnimis shenikva o shenikva rov hachitzona. We said that the inner stomach, we were discussing this at length on Shabbos, where there's a pierce in it, or if it was torn in its rove. What does that sound like? That not the majority is missing, just the majority is torn. We saw the shita on Shabbos. So it sounds like from here that we are talking about a tear, that perhaps we can say that the psul is a tear and not just that it's missing, but that it has to actually be torn. Says the Gemara, Shmuel doesn't hold of that reason. What does Shmuel hold? Rav Yaakov bar Hachi Amar Rav Yaakov bar Nachmeni Amar Shmuel Makom she'ein bo melas. He doesn't hold that that's the definition. You're crossing your wires. We learned on Shabbos that Shmuel holds the definition of the inner keres is the part of the stomach that no longer has the, what'd your son-in-law say? Rugae. He said there are these little bumps inside the stomach, or papillae, whatever that's art scroll would use papillae. So you're bringing a raya for Shmuel, but from a different camp. He doesn't hold of that definition of the keres hapnimis. So therefore, you cannot learn from there. Therefore, we don't know our answer. We'll stop right here at Udrusas Hazev. Tomorrow night, Rabbi Handler will pick up, and then I'll be back in the saddle more regularly because my fundraiser will be over. If you want me back tomorrow night, drop $250,000, and then I'll see you at 8:45 p.m. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
I'll put the money in. Is it a